everybody. Welcome. People that don't know me, I'm Gareth Bryant. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Economy. So before we get to our topic, seeing how we've got a Latin American focus today, we thought it would be a good opportunity to apply a forum or a roundtable that the department is organising. So it's part of the Socialism for the 21st Century conference. It's a roundtable on building alternatives to neoliberalism in Latin America, Friday the 13th of May at 12:30 here at Sydney Uni. And speaking on the roundtable are Marta, Annika, Michael Leibovitz and Luis Ferendez from Sydney Uni, who will be featured in our departmental seminar series in the semester 2 as well. So it's something to look forward to. So I'll just pass this around so people can get the details if you're interested. And that's co-sponsored by the Department of Political Economy. So today we have Rodrigo Acuña, who's an associate lecturer in Spanish and Latin American studies at Macquarie Uni, where he focuses on Latin American issues, and in particular Venezuelan history, politics, human rights and development policies. So he's got a book coming out towards the end of the year titled The Bolivarian Revolution, Regional Integration and Development, subtitled Venezuela's Counter-Hegemonic Foreign Policy Towards Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's coming out with Routledge, so something to look forward to. And he's going to be speaking on some of the content from that book and broader research today. So Rodrigo's talk is called Venezuelan Foreign Policy and Latin American Unification, Pushing Back the Pink Tide. Take it away, Rodrigo.
Just grab a seat and thank you for that nice introduction. I'm not very good with titles, but I do think that this title tries to capture the key issues that I want to talk about with you today, because for many years I've been looking at Venezuelan politics, Venezuelan foreign policy. It's an area which I developed an interest in 2005 when I was lucky enough to obtain a scholarship to travel to Venezuela and look at or try and answer the question whether Chavez was actually delivering in terms of his policies on a domestic front. And what I discovered, or what I concluded, was that I think with numerous complications, problems, criticisms, etc., I certainly think that was the case. And in 2005, I became aware of Venezuela's greater role in the region, the amount of money that the country was investing in regional organizations. And my view at the time, and I still continue to think that this is the situation, there really hasn't been a lot done in terms of in academia, in terms of the regional institutions which Venezuela has been supporting. In terms of the media coverage and debate, unfortunately, much was often lost in terms of the rhetoric or the rhetorical battles that Chavez himself got involved in with the United States. As an analyst, that also made things somewhat difficult for me. I think Gregory Wilpert talked about that in his very good book published a few years ago. So that's just a little bit of background in terms of my approach and involvement with Venezuela, both domestically and internationally. Now, what I want to talk to you today is give you just a little bit of background in terms of the rise of the pink tide. For Latin American studies specialists, you don't need this. I don't think you need this information, but I think it's quite important because we are heading towards, unfortunately, a return to that sort of free market economics, that radical free market economics which was implemented in the region throughout the 1990s. I think that while there is a rhetorical shift, I don't think that there is a shift in the economic policies of the political right in Latin America. I'm also going to move on then to Venezuelan foreign policy, challenging US hegemony, looking at the initial years of the Chavez administration. I'm then going to talk to you about Latin American unification, the key projects which Venezuela has been supporting, funding, lobbying other countries within the region so these institutions can become a reality. Then I'm going to be talking to you about the pushing back the pink tide and I have a subheading here, the fruits of hard labour in political manipulation, economic warfare and violence. I should add that there's certainly a level of corruption, there's certainly a level of internal corruption within these governments, and I certainly don't attempt to be dismissive of that or apologetic. They have themselves committed, there are problems, there are complications there, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. But I do think that the powers that be, the regional economic powers in the United States and global economic powers they haven't looked kindly towards these governments. They have worked with them when they can, when they've been pressured into, but as soon as they think that they can obtain an upper hand, they've certainly worked towards undermining them. And especially the way that the political right within those countries is covered within the mainstream media. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about the political future, just some final reflections on what I think could be the political future, the political map of Latin America. So if we look at the rise of the pink tide, as many of you would know, in the 1980s and 1990s, many of the US-backed military regimes in the region backed down. They either backed down because, in the case of Central America, there were huge counterinsurgency movements. They had been blocked in terms of peaceful reforms. If we head further south, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, there were massive movements against the dictatorships, and they decided to engage in more sort of peaceful demonstrations. Now, while parliamentary democracy returned, certainly an ideological shift took place within the region. And the end of the Cold War, where centre-left parties accepted neoliberal economics, where the state drastically reduced its social responsibilities in health and education, and state-owned sectors of the economy were privatised. Between 1986 and 1996, tariff levels dropped from 41.6% to 13.7%, while by the mid-1990s, non-tariff restrictions covered just 13.6% of goods, in contrast to that of the mid-1980s, which stood at 37.6%. From 1990 to 1994, Latin American countries sold off 694 state-owned companies, more than any other region, with earnings over $59.1 billion from the sales. So these are state assets, state companies that have been built through taxpayer dollars for decades, and they were sold off, in the case of Argentina, sort of crazy warehouse prices. The best case is Argentina. During the 1990s, Carlos Menem led the charge. In his administration, privatized the national telephone company Entel, Aerolíneas Argentinas, and virtually all state-owned industries and utilities, according to Skidmore and Smith. On December 23rd, 2002, the country defaulted on its $132 billion public debt. By late 2002, according to government figures, poverty affected 58%, 21 million of Argentines, while 28%, 10 million, were categorized as indigent, with insufficient incomes to cover their families' food requirements. I travelled to Buenos Aires in 2005. I was there in 1996, 1998, 1999, and by the time I arrived there in 2005, it was just shocking to see the amount of people that were displaced and living in cardboard boxes in just downtown Buenos Aires. Certainly, I will never forget those images. According to the World Bank, general poverty in Venezuela increased from 32.2% in 1991 to 48.5% in 2000, while those living in extreme poverty during those years increased from 11.8% to 25%. Across the region, while 136 million people were living in poverty in 1980, by 1990 the figure stood at 200 million and continued to increase to 225 million by 2003. According to Mark Westbrook, for more than 20 years during the neoliberal era, Latin America suffered a collapse of economic growth that was unprecedented in the region for the last century and indeed uncommon in the history of modern capitalism. For those of you who aren't aware, Mark has published a book recently called Failed, What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy, and he has, I think, 2 lengthy chapters on Latin America, so if you're interested, I would certainly recommend his work. So these economic policies certainly did not go unchallenged. Many of the political movements, the grassroots organizations which challenged the dictatorships during the 1980s and into the 1990s, many of them certainly became active politically once again. They certainly challenged the dominant political parties. There were massive demonstrations. There were strikes which paralyzed capital cities. If you looked at Latin America during the late 1990s and 2000 up until about 2003, 2004, the place was just complete chaos. Another point which sticks in my memory is when I think it was the Carlos Mesa government in Bolivia decided to drastically lower the wages of the police in La Paz, and then there was actually a period where there was a confrontation between the Bolivian police and the Bolivian military. So these sorts of privatizations and these policies and looking to cut back in terms of wages were to the point where it's fair to say that the elites within the region were actually placing themselves in danger. And they were quite lucky that if these policies had been implemented during the Cold War, I certainly think that there would have been the consequences would have been far worse, much more drastic, much more. The governments that would have come into power would have been even more radical than the pink tide. In Venezuela, in 1998, former military Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez won the presidential elections. And this was important because this was the 5th largest oil producer in the world. There's a very good book by a journalist called Bart Jones. He discusses the 2 attempted coups in 1992 in Venezuela. And Chavez was actually with a group of progressive nationalist military men, mid-ranking military personnel. He was actually organizing within the Venezuelan military since the 1980s. And then when the policies of the IMF were applied in Venezuela, these policies weren't, according to the Venezuelan constitution, they were supposed to be discussed within the Venezuelan constitution, and they weren't done so, and the price of, I think it started with an increase in the price of bus fares, and eventually became a riot, and massive protest. And that's when Chavez and his military comrades decided that the time was right for an attempted coup. And then, of course, he was incarcerated, and then he eventually ran as an anti-neoliberal candidate in the 1998 elections. Chavez's victory was followed by other leftist victories in Brazil in 2002. Lula from the Workers' Party had actually been campaigning since the 1980s. He protested against the military dictatorship in Brazil, and he had been running for several elections and losing, but by 2002 he actually won. In Argentina, the left-wing Peronists were reactivated and in 2003 took office. In Uruguay, the Popular Front, which was a broad sort of left-wing political front, which obtained sort of the highest votes in Uruguay's history in the 1970s, and then it was followed by a brutal military coup. The Frente Amplio was active once again and took office in 2004. In Bolivia, we have Evo Morales, who was a cocalero. The cocaleros were peasants who were growing coca leaves, former miners which had been dismissed. Many of the mines in Bolivia started to close down in the 1980s and 1990s. And so Morales was leading a movement of campesinos, and like I said, former miners, but these campesinos maintained that sort of trade union structure, those structures that they had as miners. And the Sandinistas, of course, if you know your Latin American history, the Sandinistas were returned to power. I think many criticisms. I wrote an article critiquing Ortega's behaviour during the 1990s. He cut, I think, many deals with the political right which were quite questionable. But the Sandinistas were returned to power in 2006. Now, within the first 2 to 3 years of the Chavez administration, Chavez was displaying elements more of what we would consider a radical sort of social democracy. And Chavez publicly claimed to be looking for a third way. Caracas, however, would certainly set itself apart from other regional governments by, number one, critiquing neoliberal economics. This was done at the Organization of American States, Inter-American Conference, summits, etc., etc. The Chavez administration prohibited the flight of the U.S. military over its territory in the pursuit of the counterinsurgency war in Colombia. It's a very long war, it's very complex, but the US, in my view, has not been playing a positive role. And it also established closer relations with Cuba, especially after the Vargas floods in late 1990, which saw the first wave of Cuban medical and teaching personnel arrive into the country. What Chavez also did is he critiqued US foreign policy in the Middle East, so he didn't simply just critique US foreign policy and domestic sort of elite policies regionally. He actually looked to take a broader sort of international role. And this was, I actually had one of these things, in life, just coincidences, that I saw Chavez before he took office in 1990. I saw him in Cuba deliver a speech, and he, talked about the need to reduce poverty. But I didn't, and I think other analysts at the time, and I say, I shouldn't say other analysts because I was actually an undergraduate student at the time, but I certainly didn't, think much of the speech. I thought, okay, this is interesting, but we'll see what happens. It could be, I think Steve Elner wrote an article at the time, 2001, and he argued that Chavez shouldn't be looked as another sort of neoliberal populist, Fujimori in Peru being the example. So that caught my attention. But when I saw some of the statements that were coming out of Caracas, they also caught my attention. And I'll just show you, if I can just escape from here. No. Could I have some assistance just to, if I hit the escape button, how can I?
Yeah, I tried that. Did that work?
I've tried escape and I'm not having any luck. Okay, just enter sheet. Yep. So we can get the and we can go to Hugo Chavez contra. Yep, that one there.
Digamos la lucha contra el terrorismo, pero no se entienda esto como una carta blanca para que se haga cualquier cosa. Y nosotros seguimos pidiendo hoy todavía, después de mes y medio, casi 2 meses, Dios mío, por la paz. Que se busquen soluciones al problema del terrorismo, sí, que se busque a los terroristas, pero así no va. Así no. Miren estos niños estaban vivos ayer, estos niños estaban comiendo con su padre y les cayó una bomba de las que están lanzando sobre Afganistán. Esto no puede ser. No se puede decir que fue un error. Un error, y van a seguir cometiendo errores. Pedimos que se piense y que se rectifique a tiempo Clamamos por eso. Lo vuelvo a repetir. Después de más de un mes, aquí lo dije, no se puede responder al terror con más terror.
So basically, this is a declaration that Chavez made. From current slide. This was after the September 11 terrorist attacks in New York, and then the Bush administration proceeding to invade Afghanistan. And the US ambassador at the time demanded a meeting with Hugo Chavez, and then in the meeting actually proceeded to rebuke Chavez quite harshly for these sorts of statements, and that was sort of the beginning, at least officially, in terms of clashes between the United States and Chavez. More importantly, though, Venezuela began to lobby other OPEC countries in order to reduce oil production and increase prices. From 1998 to 1999, average oil prices, calculated annually, went from $12.28 to $17.47, one of the largest non-war related increases of the past decade, according to Wilpert. With the 2001 hydrocarbons law, Wilpert also observed that foreign oil companies went from paying 1% in royalties to the state, to the Venezuelan state, to 16%, and in the Orinoco Belt, the country's most oil-rich region, and it's now certified as the most oil-rich region in the world, this figure increased to 33%. Now, given the historical presence of US oil companies in Venezuela, it's incorrect to say that Venezuelan oil was nationalized under the Chavez administration. It was actually nationalized in the 1970, if I remember correctly. A very good book by James Petrus, Morris Morley, and Stephen Smith, looking at that whole process and how US capital managed to diffuse and secure its assets around the oil industry. So the nationalization process that took place was not going to jeopardize US capital. And the reaction from the United States was actually quite different to the reaction in terms of the nationalization of Mexican oil in the 1940s under Cárdenas. PDMX was actually placed under international sanctions, whereas PDVSA became very good friends with the United States, US capital, US administrations, etc., etc. As I've said, given the historical presence of US oil companies in Venezuela and the importance of the state-owned oil company PDVSA to the world economy, oil and the Bolivarian Revolution's stance in regards to this commodity has always been at the heart of the conflict between Venezuela and the United States. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Moving to domestic developments, because I don't think we can discuss just international developments. In Venezuela by 2002, after the new constitution was established, the Venezuelan government implemented 49 enabling laws that democratized land ownership and access to bank credits. The right-wing opposition led a coup d'etat. This resulted in a coup d'etat in 2002. While the coup was recognized by Washington and rejected throughout the region, 48 hours later, Chavez was returned to office by loyal members of the military and his supporters. The April 2002 coup and the prolonged managers' lockout strike in PDVSA, late 2002 to early 2003, was one of the longest lockout strikes in Latin American history. This radicalized the Bolivarian process. These events highlighted to the region that a popular radical government could be elected and, in the face of local business pressure and US hostility, could be successfully defended. By early 2005, Chavez introduced the concept of socialism for the 21st century. Now, while these various anti-neoliberal, anti-austerity movements were organizing in other countries in Latin America, they certainly began to look at Venezuela as a point of reference. And this is important. They all have their own histories and complexities, but they were certainly aware of what was taking place, or became more aware of what was taking place in Venezuela. They sent delegates over. Chavez would host conferences, etc., etc. Now, enjoying particularly high oil prices after the 2003 US invasion of Iraq pushed prices close to $150 a barrel by mid-2008. Prices after 2003 commenced to increase significantly. Caracas, during much of the Chavez era, 1999, early 2003, probably minus a year from that figure, Chavez passed away in 2003. But Caracas was able to spend big on its foreign policy budgets. Writing in 2012, conservative analyst Romero and Corrales claimed that, and I quote, "Venezuelan aid has made a huge difference in a small country like Nicaragua, where the annual government budget is $1.6 billion, the same amount that Ortega has received from Chavez over the past 4 years." These observers note that from late 2003 to 2007, Caracas pursued soft balancing by providing generous oil deals to the region, while Washington, for its part, also engaged in soft balancing when it forgave $19 billion of debt owed by the poorest countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the concept of soft balancing, I'll discuss that in my book. It's developed by Corrales and Romero, where a smaller power or medium-sized power like Venezuela decides to confront the United States and challenge them wherever they can in regional forums, etc., etc., stopping short, of course, of a full conflict. In 2004, Venezuela and Cuba established the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas that was later renamed as the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. And it's basically a political alliance led by Venezuela, which as of late 2015 included 11 members: Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Dominica, St. Vincent, etc., etc. Smaller Caribbean countries there. Now, the philosophy behind ALBA is to see its members engage in economic exchanges which complement each other's economies, promotes joint ventures between state companies, and encourages development and social cultural programs. Combined, the ALBA countries have a population of over 69 million and a GDP economic zone of 636.481 billion, and a single trading currency. It's a virtual currency called El Sucre. Now, the initial accords between Cuba and Venezuela saw some 40,000, 30,000 numbers increased later. Cuban medical staff, teachers, sports trainers arrive in Venezuela and work in the most sort of shanty, the poorest parts of the country, in exchange for oil. They would calculate what would it cost to pay these doctors, and okay, well, we're not going to pay you in cash, we're going to pay you in oil. And that's how the initial accords commenced. In 2007, the ALBA agreements for Nicaragua were valued at 600 million, while by 2009, trade with Venezuela, mainly through the purchase of Nicaragua's agricultural produce, stood at 110 million. When I was in Venezuela in 2011, there were many stores called the ALBA stores. When you walked into an ALBA store, you were able to purchase clothing, and there were signs which said, these jeans have been produced in, say Bolivia. There were guayaberas from Cuba. And this is the cost that, this is the labor cost, this is the cost for the materials, and this is the price which we're selling them. And then they'd give you a table and they'd say, but this is what you would pay if you bought this through a major company. This is the sort of the profit margins that they would make. So I remember at the time walking into these stores. They certainly weren't, large shopping malls. They were more towards the sort of the smaller or medium size, what you would expect for a clothing store. But they were certainly always full. Certainly had people just walking in and out and looking to purchase, because you basically obtained really good bargains. So this was part of, this is another example of what Alba has been attempting to do. And there certainly have been problems because then the cooperatives in Nicaragua or in Venezuela, etc., they don't receive the materials on time. There are complications which take place. But this is it's important, I think, just to talk about this example because just to highlight sort of the thinking behind Alba. Now, according to one observer, Alba from March to June 2006 saw over 20,000 people participate in its literacy program, Yo Si Puedo, with a dropout rate of 29% and a pass rate of 90%. There was also the Misión Milagro, which aimed to help people within the Alba countries if they had any issues with their eyesight. And apparently the man who actually ended up personally responsible for executing Che Guevara, he benefited from that program. And in response, one of the responses from the Bush administration at the time was to send a US military medical ship to Peru, and they sort of, publicized that they were also doing things for the poor in the region, etc., etc. Now, by 2006, it is clear that Alba as an alliance within the region, as an alternative to the traditional economic accords, has peaked and for now is on the decline. Since the coup in Honduras in 2009, the alliance has stagnated in growth and is on the decline. A 70% drop in global oil prices since 2004 has hit Venezuela particularly hard, with numerous projects within Alba placed on hold, many projects within Nicaragua that are currently on hold. An economic imbalance within Alba has always existed, with Venezuela at times struggling to find partners whose commodities or services they can trade with. While Venezuelan oil for Cuban health professionals might work well, Venezuelan oil for Nicaraguan coffee does less so. Telesur, which is a jointly funded television network by other pink tide countries, not just the Alba countries, is still in operation, with more countries turning to the political right, though Telesur is currently seeing budget cuts, while the Macri government, new Macri government in Argentina, has officially withdrawn financial support for Telesur and its participation in Telesur, and that's actually going to hit Telesur quite hard because they originally provided or have been providing some 20% of Telesur's budget. And a project like Telesur is, of course, much harder to try and quantify in terms of its success. It's been blocked in Colombia, for example. We don't have accurate ratings, but it's certainly been present in the region for the past 10 years and it has become a sort of important point of reference for people who want to understand what's happening in the region, because Telesur will cover stories that CNN, BBC, etc. don't cover, and they'll send in journalists to cover conflicts which at times these other media conglomerates do not. Now, should the right-wing opposition win the presidency in Caracas, we should expect Alba, together with Petrocaribe, this is an oil alliance I'm going to talk about next, they will certainly come to an end, in my opinion. Like Alba, Petrocaribe does not work within an orthodox economic framework. On the 29th of June 2005, 16 Caribbean heads of state met in Puerto de la Cruz to discuss the creation of Petrocaribe. Out of these states, 14 signed the Petrocaribe Energy Corporation Agreement with Jamaica's Prime Minister P.J. Patterson he called the Accord a welcome lifeline. The sale of Venezuelan oil to El Caribe and eventually Central America with support of loans at extremely low interest rates. Basically, Venezuela will sell these countries oil, but there are very low interest rates that are attached to these sales, and the condition is that the money that they're saving, they're going to have to invest in local projects such as environmentally friendly tourism, schools, hospitals, etc., etc. And there have been cases of corruption, but there have also been cases, I think several cases of success. Petrocasas, for example, houses that are made from petroleum products. 100 of these homes were first built in the city of Cienfuegos in Cuba. In terms of distribution, between 2005 and 2011, Petrocaribe distributed 176 million barrels throughout the Caribbean and Central America, while by mid-2012, Petrocaribe supplied 43% of the energy needs of the region, which with storage capacities of 244,000 barrels and 1.3 million in refining. So 43% of the energy needs of the region, that's actually quite significant. By late 2011, Petrocaribe built 25 facilities, quote, with the capacity to refine 135,000 barrels per day and store 262,000 barrels and produce, etc., etc. We have 365 megawatts of electricity. In 2012, the Haitian president, Michael Martelly, visited the Artibonite, I think it's pronounced, Valley with the Venezuelan ambassador and inaugurated a community center mill. The first of the 5 agricultural centers, a reported 9 million has been invested by Petrocaribe so as to see Haiti increase its rice farming. Now, the Bush administration, together with the Obama administration, would publicly ignore, not make any declarations. But behind closed doors, they actually lobbied Haiti not to become a full member, and they were going around the region lobbying governments not to become members of this organization. While Brazil and Argentina stayed largely away from ALBA and Petrocaribe, both countries were supportive in establishing the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR. And this organization should be seen as one of the largest triumphs of Venezuelan foreign policy. In my opinion, this organization is the one that's going to outlive the Chavez and the Maduro administrations. In 2006, Brazil and Venezuela signed a privileged strategic alliance and held an unprecedented number of presidential meetings. This alliance mainly deals with energy and cross-border industrial projects. Established in May 2008, 12 South American states signed the consecutive treaty at the 3rd Summit of Heads of States held in Brasilia, Brazil. Venezuela lobbied heavily for this name and the inclusion of an agenda that covered the promotion of social policies in contrast to simply economic integration. This is the difference between Mercosur and UNASUR. UNASUR is much more of a state-led, regional, South American specifically, organization. UNASUR also has been developing what it calls the Defense Council, a council where the militaries within the region are aiming to establish a military school of defense, and the militaries within the region are no longer traveling to the United States and having military training. We know our Cold War history, we will know that some of the worst human rights violators were actually trained in US military academies. So this is a shift. UNASUR has also strengthened the South American Parliament. UNASUR has played an important role in the current peace negotiations in Havana, Cuba, between the Colombian government and the FARC. And in December 2014, the South American passport was approved by UNASUR to come into effect by 2019. and you look at your mainstream media, and there's very little coverage of this. You have to, almost with a microscope, try and find this information. Less successfully, the Bank of the South has not been established, Banco Sur, or its unified currency, el sucre, given the differences between Brazil and Argentina. So there's money that's been placed, but this bank, this development bank, the South American Development Bank, has not actually come into fruition. In early December 2014, the official headquarters of UNASUR were inaugurated in the city of Mitad del Mundo in Ecuador, named after the late Argentine President Néstor Kirchner. President Cristina Fernández said that more than just the physical presence of UNASUR's headquarters, UNASUR's creation, quote, represents the history of our nations founded 200 years ago and the second battle taking place in the 20th century for the economic independence and the cultural reconstruction of our nations. Fernández added that, quote, nowadays, we popular leaders elected by our people define our political and economic leanings. This, as it was preferable to being, quote, remembered by our people rather than be forgiven, than be forgiven in other places. In reference to democracy needing to go hand in hand with economic, I think that should be the equality. Fernández said, democracy is worthless if we do not have a strong commitment to improve our people's lives, as equality is not just a word included in our anthems, it has to be a reality in our nations. And this was one of the things about, I think, it wasn't Mario Vargas Llosa, but it might have been his son who said this, maybe another analyst. They were discussing UNASUR and said, well, UNASUR doesn't even have an office, it doesn't even have a building. UNASUR actually now does have a building, it's a very large building. But like OPEC in the 1960s, when Venezuela spearheaded that organization, the State Department had almost nothing to say about this organization. And the mainstream media, New York Times or Washington Post, they almost have nothing to say on these organizations. The New York Times, even incorrectly at one point, said that this was a Cuban-led alliance. Cuba is not even part of UNASUR. So again, it's absolutely atrocious, the coverage this is getting. After the establishment of UNASUR's headquarters in December, the director of the IMF, Cristina Lagarde, said that the integration processes in Latin America resembled a, quote, spaghetti bowl, while the US remained largely silent on the matter. In response to the IMF's comments, the Secretary General of UNASUR, Néstor Sampra, former president of Colombia between 1994 and 1998, said, and I quote, I'm very upset with the statements given by the director of the International Monetary Fund disqualifying integration processes of UNASUR, saying that they need to be rejuvenated. It's like Methuselah giving lessons in youth. He added, Mrs. Lagarde, who also played a part in the recent European recession, instead of worrying about what she calls a plate of spaghetti to disqualify the regional integration processes that are occurring here, should worry about what is happening in Europe. A lasagna plate where two countries eat cheese and meat, leaving pasta for the rest. And in contrast to UNASUR, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, in late 2011, established in late 2011, has held 4 major summits and incorporates the entire regions of Latin America and El Caribe. In practice, this means that too many agendas are being brought onto the table. Mexico, for example, is a part of NAFTA, while Central America, with the exception of Nicaragua, which is a member of ALBA, is too heavily tied into US economic and political interests. Unlike UNASUR, the CELAC has not held executive meetings during the numerous crises in the region. So, how did we do this last time? I think we...
do you want to get out of the
yeah.
slide?
Okay, let's click again. Oh, that's it. Okay, sorry. So yeah, let's just go back there. So for those of you who are sort of following Venezuela, this is the book which I aim to publish hopefully later this year. Now it's already being promoted by Routledge, so you can write down the title there. And in this is where I look at these case studies of all these organizations. Now, within the region, in UNASUR, something very interesting has happened in the sense that every time the political right mobilized against the ALBA governments or the pink tide governments, instead of the president of Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, etc., traveling to the Organization of American States to discuss the issue of the crisis, they actually first met at UNASUR. They got together at UNASUR, they would discuss collectively their different positions, and then they would attend a regional emergency summit meeting at the Organization of American States. And this is a huge change in the region, because historically, when there was a crisis, or there was the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973, heads of state of the region would meet at the Organization of American States, and the US was quite successfully able to lobby governments into accepting the new junta in power in Uruguay, Argentina, etc. So this is a huge shift, and the case studies which I look at in my chapter on UNASUR, I look at Bolivia in 2008, the defeat of the right-wing separatists and their paramilitary groups in Santa Cruz. UNASUR quite vocally stated it would not accept the disintegration of the Bolivian state. This crisis took place, and all the heads of state in South America travelled. I think that summit was held in Bolivia, and put out a statement that said that they weren't going to accept the disintegration of the Bolivian state. In Honduras in 2009, the coup against President Manuel Zelaya, that's what took place. Brasilia and Venezuela lobbied hard for Zelaya to return to office, but these developments saw the limitations of UNASUR. UNASUR was not successful. In Ecuador in 2010, the attempted coup against President Rafael Correa, there was an attempted coup against President Rafael Correa, and UNASUR again outmaneuvered the OAS. In Paraguay in 2012, the congressional impeachment of the centre-left president Fernando Lugo took place. The impeachment was seen as dubious and was condemned by most governments in South America, including Chile, which had right-wing President Piñera in power at the time, and Colombia, which always moves between the right and the ultra-right. UNASUR and Mercosur expelled Paraguay from their organization, while the Obama administration and Germany quickly recognized the new regime in Paraguay. In Paraguay, there was a moderate president, left president, a member of the clergy, liberation theology, and there was a situation where a group of peasants took some lands by force, and then there was the police attacked them. There was a massacre, and the Colorado Party, the same political party which had been in power for 50 years in Paraguay, was the backer of the institution of one of the most brutal dictatorships in the region, the Stroessner dictatorship. This same political party then came out and said that Lugo was carrying out human rights violations, and within 48 hours they actually managed to impeach him in the Congress. And like I said, every government in the region was outraged, including the right-wing ones. But the United States and Germany said, nothing. We welcome the new administration, etc., etc. And I'm almost done. In recent years, the pink tide governments have certainly made some questionable decisions, like the Workers' Party's public spending on the World Cup 2014 and the Olympics in 2016, and corruption within Petrobras. There's also certainly a lot of corruption within the Venezuelan state, and as the economic or the global price of oil has declined, these contradictions within the Venezuelan state have exacerbated. Things are really, quite chaotic and at a sort of a crisis point in the country right now. By late 2012, as Chavez was increasingly absent from public life due to illness, the Venezuelan government did not execute adequate policies with the currency exchange rate, hence pushing inflation to particularly high levels. After Chavez's death in early 2013, Maduro has found it difficult to connect with the Chavista base, while he conceded that during the Chavez era, the government had not done enough to reach out to the middle class. Chavez gave a very long interview a few months before he passed away, and he was quite thoughtful, and he conceded that at times, he certainly should have not have been as impulsive in his public statements as he was. If you Google Hugo Chavez and Jose Vicente Rangel, the former vice president, who was a journalist for 20, 30 years in Venezuela, you will see that interview. It's an interview held in the military barracks, and it's quite interesting. At a broad level, as is the case throughout the region with other pink-tide governments, Venezuela, after 16 years in power, is suffering from political exhaustion. Having said this, attacks by the private media on the pink-tide governments have been relentless and well outside what would be acceptable debate in most Western democracies. The private media in Latin America does not simply criticize governments they disapprove of, they actively work to undermine them through supporting opposition protest and black propaganda. I have a very... Maybe I'll leave that video to the end, but in this video, put together by Al Jazeera, they have a program called The Listening Post in London. It's very good. I did an interview with them a few years ago. And in this program, they actually go into details into the corruption scandal and how the judge that's leading the accusations against Lula many years ago, in fact, published a document which indicated that the best way to attack the left-wing leaders throughout the region was to go after them using the judiciary. Using the judiciary in connection, in close relation with the media by leaking information. So thus far, although I certainly think that there is corruption within the Workers' Party and Petrobras, etc., no one's actually been able to pin anything on Dilma Rousseff or Lula in the case of the former president. What's happened here? How do we get down?
Do you want to get to the next slide?
Yes, the next slide. I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. 24, 23. Writing in the Latin American Bureau in London in 2004, after violent anti-government protests in Venezuela, I argued that, and I quote, using their financial connections, the opposition have unleashed an economic war against the government by hoarding products, toilet paper, corn flour, cooking oil, coffee, etc., in warehouses or smuggling them off to Colombia. State television in Venezuela often shows images of the authorities breaking up these illegal cliques. But it is limited to the Venezuelan state media outlets, not the private, local and international press, which have most influence and the largest audiences. I'm not having any luck here getting to the next slide.
It's a funny thing. I think you just need to click in different parts of the...
Okay. So, to 24.
Doesn't really go to 24.
Can you just press the arrow on the keyboard?
I tried that too.
Try the mouse on a piece of paper.
Oh yeah, good tip.
Okay. We'll use the paper from now. Thank you. Okay, writing in the Huffington Post Dr. Francisco Dominguez, senior lecturer at Middlesex University, cited sections of the Venezuelans' opposition, the amnesty bill, which states that amnesty will be given to people who have, and this amnesty law has actually been approved by the right-wing controlled National Assembly. And it's absolutely extraordinary that there's, again, the media coverage on this issue is just amazingly silent. If the Chavistas or anyone in the pink-tied governments had attempted to do something like this, I mean, it would be a total outrage. The bill states that people are going to be pardoned who, and I quote, incitement, who have engaged in incitement to disobey the law, incitement to hatred and crime, apology, incitement to crime, assault and battery, violence or resistance to authority, and disobedience to authority, causing panic in the community or keeping it under distress by the dissemination of false information, conspiracy, obstruction of public roads with the aim to set up fire or other attacks against passing vehicles, damaging transportation systems as well as public IT and communication, destruction or damaging of roads and related infrastructure or for public communication, property damage, conspiracy and terrorism, importation, manufacture, possession, supply or concealment of explosives or incendiary devices, disturbance of public peace, insulting a civil servant in its various forms, use of minors to commit crimes, arson and other crimes involving danger for the public in general in various forms, treason and other crimes against the nation. And the list just goes on and on and on. It's basically a confession of all the crimes that the ultra-right in Venezuela has committed for the past 16 years, commencing with the coup d'etat in 2002. I think what's happened is that the battery on this device is not...
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm trying.
If it doesn't work, you can probably just keep talking.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Late last year, the Venezuelan government lost control of the National Assembly. However, according to one analyst, there was a notable voter abstention among the Chavistas who are unhappy with Maduro. According to a data analysis poll in February 2016, 63% of Venezuelans say Maduro should quit this year or be removed via recall referendum, versus some 29.3% of Venezuelans who want him to keep governing until 2019, when his mandate ends. More recently, I quote, a mayor was gunned down in a drive-by shooting just meters away from his doorstep. A legislator shot by paramilitaries in plain sight outside a bodega. A solidarity activist butchered in a home invasion. 2 police run over by militants in a stolen bus. These are just the latest in a wave of killings in Venezuela. This has been taking place in the last month. And it looks like the opposition is increasingly looking to, again, create a climate of chaos in order to provoke a recall referendum and using violence to assassinate members of the government. I only have 2 more slides.
Yeah, you talk and I'll see if I can do it. Yeah.
So this is a protest that took place 2 weeks ago in Brazil, and the sections of the Brazilian upper middle class, people who don't identify with the PT government, it was quite famous because they went to protest, but they had their Afro-Brazilian nanny push the pram of their children, and it sort of highlighted that the sort of atmosphere that's taking place in Brazil. Certainly there are many people, supporters of the PT, which are quite unhappy with their government, but they were also mobilised in massive demonstrations which are obtaining nowhere near the same sort of coverage that the protests against the government are sort of getting. último slide. Muchas gracias. Macri in Argentina has accepted to pay back the vulture funds, so moving to sort of the final reflections on the future political map of Latin America. Macri in Argentina has accepted to pay the vulture funds in New York, 4.6 billion. And this is something that the Kirchners lobbied quite hard for, almost a decade, not to pay back these funds or to restructure them in a favourable manner for Argentina. However, he only won the presidency by 51% of the vote and has been facing massive protests by tens of thousands of government workers he has fired. The last statistic that I've looked at is 60,000. The numbers are increasing. In Venezuela, while the Chavistas may indeed lose a recall referendum or the next presidential elections, it is doubtful Chavismo will not be a part of the political landscape for the coming decades, given its deep community roots. In a similar manner, while Dilma has been harshly criticised by her own base, I covered this point before, massive protests have recently taken place in defence of her government. Received almost no or very little media attention. Finally, should the political right not display political and economic moderation throughout the region in the coming years, the new electoral victories may be rather short. Last point, I didn't provide statistics in terms of actual poverty reduction under these governments, but until the last probably 2 to 3 years, they certainly were looking quite good. There's certainly many examples in institutions like the United Nations, which have, CEPAL, have given these governments some good reports in terms of addressing illiteracy, poverty, health, education, etc., etc. On that point, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rodrigo. So we've got about 20 or so minutes for discussion up until 5:30. So I can make a speaking list, or if somebody wants to start us off with a question for Rodrigo, feel free to jump in. Phil?
Sure. That was really good. Thanks for that. That's a great overview. I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity, basically, on two things. Firstly, socialism in the 21st century. I'm not clear on exactly what that means in a technical definition. And secondly, obviously the pink tide looks like it's collapsing now. How do you explain that in terms of just Venezuelans no longer wanting to vote for the left-wing party? How does that, why has that happened in the context of poverty reduction?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first point, socialism for the 20th century, I think this concept itself hasn't been completely well defined by the pink tide governments. Maybe Correa, being an economist who has a PhD, he talks about a citizens' revolution. Maybe he has he has attempted to define the term in the best manner. He has a book in Spanish which I hope someone will translate into English called From Banana Republic to No Republic. And it's his reflections on the state of Ecuador prior to him taking office. I think one of the key things of this concept, which has been thrown around a lot, is that certainly these governments these movements believe that there need to be regular elections. There need to be some degree of transparency. Just about all of them have enacted within the Constitution clauses which allows these governments to be recalled. So the Venezuelan opposition actually triggered a recall referendum in 2004 and they lost that. But I certainly think that some scholars have argued what socialism for the 21st century should be, but not enough has actually been done by the protagonists themselves in terms of trying to define this concept. In terms of why Venezuelans are turning away from the Bolivarian revolution, if you can't purchase toilet paper, if you can't purchase chickens, beef, coffee, etc., etc., if you have to wait in line from 3 in the morning until 8 o'clock in the morning to be able to do your basic groceries, and you have to have organise for someone. I witnessed this in last year when I was there. If you have to organise someone in the family to drop off the money that you're going to spend on your groceries, because people waiting outside government stores are robbed en masse by gangs, you're increasingly going to be turning against the government. And the decline in oil prices has certainly affected the government. The government did not make adequate adjustments in time. There was a period there where Chavez was quite ill, and then he passed away, and the Venezuelan government, I think, was almost sort of frozen. And I think that the economic and political war of attrition is just taking its toll. When I was in Venezuela in 2005, I had a meeting with a very high-ranking member of the government, and I said, why do you think your government is going to survive, let's say, the next 5 years, in contrast to what happened to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua? Your agenda, from my perspective, is very radical, and I think that you've not only come under attack by local business community and attempted coup, etc., etc. Your main enemy is without a doubt going to be the United States, and they're going to attempt to do everything to sabotage your political economic project. And his response, he was very confident, and he said, well, we just have very deep grassroots organizations and movements. This is not a middle-class led revolution, this is a broader revolution. But like I said, I think that the economic situation, the fact that Maduro does not have the political ability that Chavez has or had. I saw Chavez in 2011, and it was like seeing a rock star. I saw Maduro it was just like, street after case and case. It was just incredible to see Hugo Chavez. You really felt like you were witnessing history. In the case of Maduro, I saw Maduro in the Plaza Bolívar, and there must have been about 5,000 supporters there. I was actually able to walk incredibly close, maybe 5 or 6 meters away from him. And he was just talking, and the cameras were rolling, and he just doesn't seem to have that ability to connect. It's a big act to follow. It's certainly a big act to follow, and that's the sort of one of the problems of the whole process, is that so much revolved around Chavez. One of the ways Chavez would attack the opposition was just to, we're going to do cadena nacional. I'm going to talk for the next 3 hours, and everyone on all of the television stations are going to have to broadcast my speech. And it sort of just, blast the opposition. And I could understand that, but I didn't agree with it. And now, the polarization which had always been present in the country is now swinging towards the opposition, in favour of the opposition.
Okay, I've got a couple of people who want to speak. If anyone else wants to, just put your hand up and I'll get to you. So we've got Adam there.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. I really look forward to the book coming out later on this year. Love to feature it on the PPE blog.
Thank you, Adam.
If you're so willing. Probably got 2 questions really. One is more about a commentary on the book in front of you, which I have to confess I haven't read, and about how we use that book to understand structural adjustment programs, neoliberalism, and the pink tide, because the title of the book is Failed. But if we counterpose that to an essay that I always use in research and teaching by David Ruscia on structural adjustment programs, he actually argues that from a Marxist class perspective, neoliberalism and structural adjustment hasn't failed in Latin America, it was entirely successful. How does he argue that from a Marxist perspective? Well, if we read it in class terms, it was never intended to deliver full employment, growth, equity.
I would agree with that.
It was always actually intended to deliver further exploitation. So I don't know about Wiesbrandt's argument on this, but I think there's something perhaps problematic about seeing it as a failure. Neoliberalism is entirely successful, but from a different class perspective. I just wanted your thoughts on that. And the second question is that during the 2002 coup, I had the fortune or misfortune to be in Washington at the time, and I was conducting interviews with the NED and USAID, and I had Carl Gershman in interview, who was the then president of the National Endowment for Democracy, an old Cold War warrior. And Michael Shifter, who was the Latin America regional specialist. And I had them in an interview, and ostensibly I was there to talk about the NED's programs in Mexico, but obviously the coup unfolded, so I kind of threw that in. He said, well, what do you think about what's going on in Venezuela? And they said, well, a coup is a coup is a coup, and of course we don't condone that, but this guy had to go. And I just wondered, to what extent does your geopolitical focus on the region bring in the NED and USA and these sorts of agencies, which have of course been quite effective recently in Cuba, I believe, as well? Just open that particular focus up.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms of the book and this analysis, I mean, of course, neoliberal economics, structural adjustment programs by the IMF and the World Bank, certainly if you're part of the Latin American elite and you want to have access to consumer goods from China and from the United States, you're going to view these policies as successful. That's not going to be the case if you're a Mexican auto worker. That's not going to be the case if you've been working in a mine in Bolivia for the past 20 years. So really, it depends in terms of where you sit within society and what your political views and your economic interests are. I find it interesting that other than some of the shifts in political rhetoric, the Latin American elites and their political representatives have almost learnt nothing from what happened during the 1990s. They have almost learnt nothing in terms of how they place themselves in danger by doing things such as diminishing the wages of the Bolivian police force to the point where there was almost a mini civil war taking place in La Paz in the late 1990s. I find that fascinating. Capriles Rodonsky in Venezuela said that Chavez should be thanked and he should be congratulated for placing the issue of reducing poverty on the political agenda, but then he talks about providing political asylum for all the Cuban doctors and teachers in the country, which of course will provoke a reaction from Cuba to withdraw these professional staff within Venezuela. The Venezuelan opposition is also talking about privatizing the government-run program Misión Gran Vivienda, which has been providing tens of thousands. I mean, it's impressive the number of houses and apartment blocks for low-income earners that have been built. And you would think that, again, the mainstream media that travel to Venezuela, they just don't happen to see them when they're there. Of course, there are many terrible stories that you can write about. You can write about the crime, you can write about the demonstrations, the violence, etc., etc. But the government undeniably has done many things in terms of delivering to its constituency. So I find that interesting. In terms of Ned, I remember seeing an interview with Schiffer a few years ago, and I think Greg Grandin was on the board, and I do remember him taking that position, saying, "Well, yes, military coups in Venezuela, in Latin America, are terrible, but they sort of almost asked for it, so almost, and I mean that highlights that think tanks in the United States and the Democrats, the Obama administration, I mean, what they prefer are coup d'etats which are light. They prefer that these governments step down due to economic pressure, due to political pressure. But if the military does have to come out, well, then they're not. They are going to support that. They would not. They prefer not to see a violent, coup and the president, being dragged out, his corpse, etc., etc. But in Honduras, I mean, the President Zelaya was dragged out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning in his pajamas and placed on a plane to Panama. Many people died during the April 2002 coup in Venezuela. Eva Gollinger has written a very detailed book, and she's probably led the sort of the research in terms of NED and the sort of funding that they have been providing the right-wing opposition within Venezuela. So certainly, and getting back specifically to the question, yes, I do cover that in my research. And they are certainly present, and they have been working behind closed doors. There was a very good article published in Bloomberg recently on a Colombian hacker which has been participating in the elections in Latin America in the past few years. I wrote an article, a media article, in 2006 when Manuel López Obrador lost the elections, and there was fraud in those elections. Manuel López Obrador, in my opinion, was going to win those elections. He was a moderate centre-left. He was certainly not as radical as the Venezuelan project, but he was viewed as too far left, to be, for him to win the presidency. So, if I remember correctly, I think the officers of the electoral board, the power went out. Manuel López Obrador was winning, and then when the power came back on, he was losing, and then he lost the elections. I mean, these sorts of things these sort of dirty tricks have continued, and these pro-democracy front organisations, they've been right in the middle of it.
Thank you.
We've got 8 minutes left. I've got 3 questions, so could I suggest we take all the questions together and then give Rodrigo a chance to respond? So I've got you two, so I don't know either of your names, and I've got Emma as well.
Rodrigo, you were talking about Venezuela being a point of reference for all Latin American countries, and I was wondering now collapsing what's going to mean. And it seems to me that Latin America is always involved in a circularity of processes, never really achieve a different end. And I was just wondering whether this is going to trigger the same what happened in the 60s with the domino effect of every single country going the same way towards a dictatorship again.
Well, I don't think.
We just take your question and Emma's question too.
Mine's related, but your comment about, your last comment about the crisis of entire governments and the right coming to power, that maybe this is really tenuous. I'm just wondering whether you're actually pointing to something different, because what you're describing is the emergence of a particular kind of democratic strategies and mobilisations, which, your list of all the kind of strategies of the insurgency against anti-governments actually highlights, one, the polarised nature of these electorates, even if they're very uneven, the very fact that they're basically seeking to destroy the legitimacy of the existing government. And whether that process of delegitimisation, if you look at the time model, what's happened in Thailand, where one party can't win, the urban kind of middle classes, they can't win, but they basically seek an alliance with the military. Now, the nature of a dictatorship, or maybe something else, and if you go to Colombia, maybe it's more suggestive, where the nature of violence is not accidental. There's violence which is part of the development process, the appropriation of land, the kind of division, organisation of urban society, and now the delegitimisation of FARC and any other political project by the systematic elimination of social leaders, journalists, human rights activists, political leaders on the left. So we're actually witnessing what I suppose Adam Curtis talks about as odierism, which is the idea that in fact what you generate is a kind of chaotic state where there's a kind of acquiescence in a kind of legitimacy falsely gained by what you're saying is media representations of the opposition in Caracas having legitimate claims.
And we'll go to Emma and then give Rodrigo a chance to respond.
So, on the flip side to all the mainstream media presentations in Venezuela, there's been a lot of praise on the left, on some of the English-speaking left, about how great Venezuela's been, etc., and how it's transitioned from a representative democracy to a participatory one. But given that the recent decline in oil prices seems to be threatening all those gains, how deeply ingrained were those changes to begin with? And then I've got kind of another point kind of connected to that. Like, this current kind of decline, perhaps of the pink tide, like, looking back, their rise kind of coincided with a time of really high resource prices, like high oil prices and everything, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, etc. And there's been all this talk about using those rents to like invest in social programs, etc. But how, like, it just doesn't seem like there's been a great, deep kind of structural change, given that just purely because oil prices or resource prices have changed, that this can all just kind of go bust completely. So I guess it's more of a comment. This is not really a question, but it doesn't seem like they were able to talk about real, like, spending rents on social programs is very popular, but talking about, say, income tax or other issues, say in Venezuela, that is electorally very unpopular. So yeah, like, it just seems like the rhetoric didn't actually, in some other instances, match up to what actually happened.
Okay. I'll just use that last point and then I'll return to the beginning.
Yeah.
The income tax in Venezuela, there were many structural changes. I know that because I have several friends who are accountants that know people that work within the government, and they gave me some information about that. And it's now moved to the point where people have to take their ID cards so they don't purchase 200 chickens and then sell them in the black market. Now, there are ways around that, but the government has certainly been moving towards tax reform at various levels of society. But of course, there's certainly been a lot of resistance, but I do think that the government has attempted to do its best to fight that fight. I don't think they've done as well in terms of creating strong organisations or bodies which can investigate corruption and then hold people that are engaging in acts of corruption accountable. Although, having said that, there are, I think from last count, there was something like 140 people within the government and private sector that were arrested and they were being placed on trial for all acts of corruption. But again, if the Maduro government does this, the media coverage that it received is almost zero in the mainstream media. In terms of the domino effect, I certainly think that the political right has been organising. They sort of went quiet. They sort of went, they weren't as visible after the collapse or the huge challenge to free market economics with the rise of the pink tide. But they were certainly organising. Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, for example, have been organising the Alliance of the Pacific, which is like a counter-trade bloc to ALBA. So they were always in communication and they were always organising. And they've been, political leaders of the right have been travelling to Venezuela. They've been calling for Leopoldo López's release, even though he made statements publicly, calling for people to overthrow the government, to engage in acts of violence, to question Maduro's electoral legitimacy. So certainly they are organising and certainly they are attempting to pick off the leaders of the Latin American left one by one. In terms of the approach, to answer your question, Michael, or to attempt to answer your question, I think in the case of Venezuela, the opposition have used both elections and violence. So when they were doing so bad at the polls in 2005, they didn't even stand for election in the National Assembly, the Venezuelan Congress. They just abstained. And what they declared publicly was that the elections were going to be rigged, that there was no way that they could win them, even though any credible expert on Venezuela will tell you that the Venezuelan elections are probably the most monitored internationally, with the UN, with the EU, with the UNASUR present, with the Jimmy Carter Institute for Democracy, or whatever its full title and name of that organization is. When Jimmy Carter, after 2004, said that Chavez had won the referendum legitimately, he was actually physically attacked at a restaurant in a high part of Caracas. So they've always used both approaches. When they think that they can win an election, they'll present themselves. When they don't think that they can win an election, they will then engage in declaring that the government is illegitimate, that there was fraud, etc., etc. In terms of participatory democracy, in 2005, I certainly did witness some of the community councils. I know that that's your research, Emma. And I do think that these organizations and these mechanisms are going to outlast, even if the Maduro government loses power, because they worked for, the many community activists worked for years, if not decades, to support Chavez as a presidential candidate. I remember talking to school teachers which went to defend local high schools that were being attacked by the opposition during the coup in 2002. People were attempting to burn down the government schools. We're talking primary schools and high schools. We're talking about hijacking trucks that were carrying textbooks. Venezuela has been, there have been many battles in Venezuela politically for the past 16 years. So I don't think that these activists are simply going to just, close shop and walk away. The former president of Uruguay, Mujica, said that if this atmosphere of violence continues, do not be surprised if someone within the Venezuelan military actually carries out a coup d'etat and then decides to implement a very much more sort of in-depth, harsh, etc., revolution. So I think that the political right might very well sort of mistime that and misjudge their actions. In terms of your last point was about structural change. In terms of structural change, I do think that there have been many structural changes, but the amount of changes which countries like Venezuela need are just enormous. I mean, they're not changes that one administration, two administrations, three administrations are going to solve. These are literally decades and decades and decades of underdevelopment, which no government in 10 years, 20 years, 25 years can solve. Caracas has, one of the things that the government did was establish an accord with the London Mayor, Ken Livingstone, in terms of garbage collection, because Caracas, before the Chavez administration, didn't have basic garbage collection established. And I can go on just one thing after another. So I don't think that these grassroots organisations are simply going to pack shop, but they certainly feel threatened. They certainly, members of the government that I talked to said that people were quite cautious when they were lining up for food to do their groceries, because there was a lot of anger at how sharp, how drastically things changed in Venezuela after Chavez's death. I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
All right, thanks again, Rodrigo, and thanks everyone.